Hey everyone, and welcome to the last episode of this year, where I'll be drinking a hot chocolate from Aroma Espresso Bar, and we're going to be having a chat on empathy. We're going to be talking about what empathy is, as well as some of the misconceptions surrounding it. We'll go through a scenario, and we'll also talk about how to actually embody empathy. So with that said, let's get started. So how many of you believe that having empathy is actually a trivial thing to do? Because the truth is, it's actually not. It's not trivial at all. And before we get into why it's not trivial, let's just talk about what empathy really is. So my definition of empathy is the ability to understand another person's perspective or their feelings. And the reason why in today's society it's not so trivial to embody is because it's actually either it's misunderstood to the point where it's either overdone or it's underdone. And what do I mean by that, right? Well, when I say it's overdone, I mean that people are overly caring for people such that they want to go ahead and solve their problems for them. So, for example, say you're a leader in a company, like a manager or something like that, and somebody comes to you to talk about a problem. And instead of just understanding the problem and, just hearing them out, you decide to go ahead and solve the problem for them. And the truth is, when you do that, what you're doing is you're actually disabling the other person. And when you disable another person, what you do is you enable mediocrity. And that's not actually of service to them. What you want to do is you want to ensure that they're still capable of solving their problem, but you hear them, you understand where they're coming from. And then on the other hand, empathy is also underdone, right? And what I mean by that is that people don't really care too much, or, they're a little bit more like on the selfish side of things. And one of the reasons that could actually occur is, not only just because they don't care, but it could be because they're actually afraid of being vulnerable. And the truth is, having empathy actually requires a lot of mental and emotional energy. And another problem we have in our society is that the word empathy is often confused for the word sympathy. And the difference between the two is that empathy is feeling an emotion as somebody, while sympathy is feeling an emotion for somebody. And the reason that people sympathize instead of empathize is because sometimes they just lack the experience to, resonate with the other person, or sometimes they just, don't have the imagination to be able to put themselves in the other person's shoes. And you might be wondering, well, why is this skill so important in our workplace, right? So there were actually a lot of studies then that showed how significant empathy is in the workplace, okay? So there was one survey done by EY which showed that 88% of people believe empathy fosters inclusivity, and 55% of employees actually leave their job due to a lack of empathy from their senior management, okay? And as a Gen Z, I also have to add that according to Deloitte, Gen Zs rank empathy as the second most important quality in management. And that being said, can you think of a time where empathy really impacted your work experience? Here's an example, okay? Let's say you're doing a task and you ask for clarification on a task to one of your managers, and the manager responds with, "When I was your age, we worked 12-hour days without complaining. You just need to toughen up and deliver." How would you feel like this statement lacked a little bit or even a lot of empathy? Well, I think from the statement you can see that the manager lacked listening skills, right? And I think something to also recognize is that this manager also failed to realize that the work environment has shifted quite a lot, right? We're in a digital age, and in the 1900s and things like that, things were very different. So he was unable to kind of resonate with that idea and understand that things have changed over time. And if you were in this situation, what kind of an impact would it have on you? It would probably leave you feeling a little bit undervalued, unsupported, and even disconnected from the team, right? It's just that you don't really want to work with them anymore. And I think that when you go through a scenario like this, you might be wondering, well, why is empathy so overlooked or misunderstood in our leadership system, right? And I think a major contributor to this, or a major reason, is because a lot of our leadership is very male dominated. And there's a stigma associated with empathy that it's some sort of a weakness that actually causes people to become dependent. But we've actually already cleared that empathy misunderstood results in dependency, right? Not actual empathy. And then there's also another misunderstanding out there that, if you embody empathy, you're unable to make tough decisions. But that's actually not true, because empathy is like the communication system between an input and an output. It's not actually the input or the output. And this actually reminds me of a LinkedIn post that I recently saw, which described how leaders only need to embody empathy and they do not need to be bold. And I actually disagreed with that statement. Why? Because empathy, like I said, is just a communication system, right? But being bold, if I were to define being bold, I would define it as going against the grain when necessary, right? Being bold is a very actionable trait. So empathy allows you to understand what somebody is going through, and then being bold allows you to execute or, take action. So for example, say you're a leader and you witness workplace bullying, right? And then the victim comes and talks to you about it. And if you empathize with them, you're just like, oh my God, yeah, like I understand where you're coming from, blah, blah, blah. But what are you going to actually do about it? Because as a leader, you do have to take some disciplinary action, right? And it's the ability to be bold that will enable you to take that disciplinary action. And even when you take that disciplinary action, it's also important to embody empathy in that situation too, right? Because communicating in a specific way will actually lead to better outcomes instead of using harshness or indifference. So, speaking of communicating in a harsh and indifferent way, let's talk about some of the reasons why empathy is actually misplaced in the workplace. I think a major reason is because of hierarchies, right? Because the higher you are on a hierarchy, it's actually proven that the higher you are, the less you care about the people that work under you. And the less you care about them, you won't really care to treat them in an empathetic and compassionate way. And sometimes also a major contributor are time constraints because, when people are under a huge time constraint, they panic and then forget to communicate with empathy when dealing with the coworkers. But it's also important to realize that there are ways to prevent this from happening and to actually practice embodying more empathy. So let's get into that. So, number one, to embody more empathy is being able to let go of your sense of self or your identity. So, pretend that you're just an ordinary human being talking to another ordinary human being, because at the end, that's really what you are, right? No matter how high you are on this hierarchy, on this societal food chain, you're still an ordinary human being, and it's important to realize that when you consider yourself in such a way, it'll be easier for you to resonate with another person and understand where they're coming from. And in order to do so, you need to embrace vulnerability. Number two, it's also important to be curious and ask a lot of questions, okay? So instead of, when you're communicating with someone, instead of, building a narrative out of what they're saying and coming from a place of judgment, just stay really open-minded, and in order to get to a conclusion, ask more questions than automatically coming up with the answer, okay? And number three, what you want to do is you want to practice active listening and having eye contact when you're communicating, okay? Because this builds trust between people and it enables people to open up, be vulnerable, and having empathy and people who are willing to understand one another in a workplace actually leads to more productivity in the workplace. So to end off over here, I want you guys to think of a time where you were having a conversation with somebody or you were in a social setting and you could have embodied a little bit more empathy. And I want you to recall that situation and think about the specific things that you could have done to embody more empathy. And the next time you have a conversation with somebody, try to avoid making those same mistakes. And with that said, guys, I'll see you next time.
This program is meant for entertainment purposes only. It is not meant to replace any educational programs or represent a professional coaching program. All examples provided by the author and speaker are purely anecdotal and are not meant to represent any institutions or companies in affiliation with the creator.